everyone from Geneva, and good morning or good evening to those in other time zones. It's Tony Consul, Head of Communications here again with our Director General, Alexandre Juniac, as well as Brian Pearce, our Chief Economist. Today, as announced, we will look at the industry outlook for 2020 and into 2021. The first time we've done that since the start of this crisis. Brian will take us through that outlook with a few slides. Alexandre will have a few remarks after that. And then we will throw it open to questions and answers. Question and answers, as usual, will be through the chat function. So I would encourage you to type in your responses or your answers as questions come to mind, and we'll take them in order after the two presentations. So with that, I'll ask Brian to get us started.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. Let me start with looking at air travel measured by RPKs globally here. As you can see, we are expecting the April outturn to be the low point of this crisis. Obviously, that's highly dependent on there not being a second wave of COVID-19, but certainly there's been an improvement visible during May. And as you can see here, this is the profile that we would expect to see developing. So, a phased opening of markets. We've seen that with domestic markets. We're starting to see that with bilateral arrangements internationally with neighbouring countries. But we're expecting, longer haul markets to take some time to open. And obviously, there's also the impact of the extraordinarily deep economic recession in the second quarter. Although, if you look at most economic forecasts during the second half of the year, from that very low point, they are projecting a rise of economic activity. So, as you can see, a fairly decent rise in air travel, but by the end of the year, we would still expect to see the level of air travel RPKs down 36% compared to where they were a year ago. And we've based that on two things, really. One is a survey of passengers that we did in April, which you can see on the left-hand side, which shows there's considerable pent-up demand for travel. So around about 60% of the passengers surveyed, and there are almost 5,000 surveyed, said that they'd either fly immediately or wait a month or two before flying. But having said that, of course, there's 40% of travellers which are sort of more or less lost for the immediate future, either because of the impact of the recession or because of a loss of confidence. And then secondly, we've used the projected path of COVID new cases in countries to anticipate when markets are likely to open. So you can see it in a phased approach, and that those factors have driven that recovery profile in the passenger market. Now, for air cargo has had a very different experience to the passenger market. Principally, of course, because shipping boxes around the world is not a vector for COVID, but also because there's been a strong demand for cargo services to supply medical equipment and also e-commerce and global supply chains. So as a result, we've only seen a fall of 28% in the volume of cargo traffic compared to the 95% fall that we saw in the passenger market in April. But what you can also see from this chart is that the grounding of the passenger fleet, and remember that passenger aircraft typically carry 50-55% of cargo volumes in the belly holds of those aircraft. The grounding of the passenger fleet has meant actually there's been a capacity shortage relative to that level of demand for cargo services. There's been a real crunch on freighters and we've seen a rush of airlines converting passenger aircraft to carry cargo. But even so, as you can see, the impact on the load factor shot up, over 10 percentage points to over 58% in April. And we know that cargo rates have risen. Actually, cargo revenues are higher today than they were at the same period last year. The cargo business has been strong. But for the airlines as a whole, of course, that's not enough. The cargo business, cargo revenues are a relatively small portion of the total business. Before the crisis, around about 15% of total revenues. And so, as you know from previous presentations that we've given, there's been an enormous cash burn because of the collapse in passenger revenues. Airlines, even though they've grounded the passenger fleet, have not been able to avoid a number of costs which are fixed or semi-fixed, and of course there have been ticket refunds. So you'll recall that we estimated that in the second quarter of this year, we estimated that airlines would be burning through their cash, using up their cash reserves at a rate of just over $60 billion. And airlines started the year with not much cash. That's clearly an unsustainable situation. So consequently, the support that we've seen from governments, and to date, we reckon that governments have provided about $123 billion of aid, of cash in various forms to airlines, has been essential as life support for the airline industry, given that rate of cash burn. But this comes not without its issues, and you'll see in the dark lines there, those are the reimbursable elements, either costs that have been, or taxes that have been deferred, but more importantly, aid cash that's been provided in the form of debt. And that's the issue. Airlines are moving into this restart period with very substantial debt burdens. And this shows that the industry started the crisis at the end of last year with about $430 billion worth of debt. And that's about 4.6 times cash flow or earnings. But what with the aid from governments, which is, there's about $70 billion worth of debt, and also the borrowings that airlines have made, at least the stronger airlines have made from capital markets, that's added another sort of 50 billion. They're likely to end the year with about $550 billion of debt, and very much lower earnings. So at the start of the restart period, airlines are going to really be wanting cash to service that debt and possibly have to repay some of that debt. So what does the outlook look like in 2021? Well, you can see here that we're expecting from 2020 levels a strong rise in air travel, 55%. But as you can see, that's from a low base. And so that level in 2021 is still something like 29% lower than where the air travel market was in 2019. This is the impact of the recession, the slow opening of borders, the slow return of confidence to passengers. But you can see that cargo actually, again, has a different experience because as the economies return to work, businesses will need to restock, and they will, as they have done in every upturn in recent decades, they will turn to air transport to quickly restock inventories, and this is a demand for air cargo services on top of the medical supply services and the e-commerce. So we'd actually expect to see the level of air cargo volumes back up to 2019 levels by 2021. But the passenger, the air travel business is going to be harder. And undoubtedly airlines are going to need to try to stimulate demand through relatively low fares, and you can see here passenger yields. So we're estimating that passenger yields are probably going to be down 18% in 2020. As airlines, and we've already seen this in the Chinese domestic market, as airlines seek to stimulate demand. Obviously, a critical thing for getting passenger confidence back is confidence in the biosecurity, that flying is safe, and the layered approach, the measures that have been announced by ICAO's CART will play a really important role in that. But undoubtedly, airlines are going to have to seek to stimulate demand also by relatively low yields. And the challenge there for profitability is that certainly for non-fuel unit costs, they've been rising. And we're expecting in 2021 that they will still be relatively high, partly because of the restrictions on the utilization of aircraft that the COVID procedures have put in place, which will reduce turnaround times. And in particular, if we see an extension of some governments pushing to keep seats free in between passengers, this substantially reduces aircraft utilization. We're expecting to see load factors something a bit less than 75% in 2021. Obviously, in 2019, they reached new records at 83% or so. If we look to the regions, we see the net effect of all that is that this year we're expecting to see widespread losses. So these are net revenues as a percent. These are net profits as a percent of revenues. Last year we saw North America, substantially ahead of other regions. Africa probably down at the bottom. We'd still expect to see that divergence in 2020, but all regions are going to be in substantial loss, and we reckon that that will represent between 15 and 30% of revenues in 2020. What we've done today is to take a first look into the financial consequences of the restart period in 2021. Obviously, there are great uncertainties about many aspects of the outlook in 2021. So we've taken in this particular forecast, we've taken a view that COVID-19 will steadily be contained. So in this particular forecast, we've not built in a second wave of COVID, and we're basing this forecast on a phased opening of markets. But we've been rather cautious on the return of business travel and the return of passenger confidence, and obviously we've built in the impact of the recession, which will obviously damage the ability of people to travel. But we are still expecting to see a significant rise of revenues in 2021. But as you can see, that will allow airlines to substantially reduce their losses, but we wouldn't expect to see those losses to be eliminated in 2021. We're still expecting net losses of $15.8 billion. That's 2.8% of revenues, and that's a similar pattern to the one we saw in the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. Obviously, much larger, but if you look back at that period, there was the depth of the crisis in 2008, followed by better performance, but still a loss before a recovery in the subsequent year. For investors, if we take the investor perspective, they're more interested in the return on invested capital in the industry and comparing that to what's known as the cost of capital, which is effectively the expected return. Investors are still expecting returns of 6 or 7%. There's going to be an improvement, we think, in the performance for investors by airlines in 2021, but at a negative 4.9%. That's still a long way from what investors would expect to earn. And I've got a couple of slides now just to remind us that even before the crisis, the industry, although we had some fairly good performance at the aggregate level, that was driven by only a relatively small number of airlines. You can see the change in economic profits from 2008 to the couple of years before the crisis was driven really by 20 or 30 airlines. There was a long tail of airlines that were just breaking even, hadn't improved, and some substantial loss makers. So, even before the crisis, a lot of airlines were in quite fragile position in terms of their profit and loss accounts. And if we look at the balance sheet, a similar story there. The majority of the industry had debt of 5 or 6 times EBITDA, which is an earnings measure close to cash flow. So fragile position. The consequence of the government aid being, the majority of government aid being in debt, and the additional debt governments that airlines have raised from capital markets in order to get the cash they needed to survive, has meant we estimate 120 billion rise in debt. Now earnings will be lower, so EBITDA will be still relatively low in 2021. The consequences are, if we look at the ratio of debt to that earnings measure, from something like 4.6 times, so debt 4.6 times earnings in 2019, could rise, more than threefold in 2021. Clearly, that is not a sustainable situation. So what are the consequences? Well, firstly, we need to see airlines raise a lot more equity. They've raised about $30 billion of equity this year, but in order to make debt affordable, they need more equity. So either that is one path, a difficult one given the state of markets. Secondly, we could see governments ending up having to swap the debt they've provided to airlines for equity, i.e. a lot more government ownership, or we could see the consequence of this being a lot of airline failures and the consequence consolidation. It's very difficult to determine which path the industry will follow, but clearly there are substantial consequences from the heavy debt burden. And I think just finally, there are also consequences for the wider economy, because the connectivity airlines provide, the city pairs that they connect, are critical for the economic recovery, because they provide the bridges along which flows of trade, investment, tourism can flow and generate the economic recovery that everybody needs. As you can see, in April, we saw the number of city pairs being served fall to critically low levels. Judging by the schedules and the restarts that we're starting to see, we would expect some recovery from that. We'd expect city pairs down perhaps 24-25% this year. But clearly, there's a risk if policy is not supportive for airlines. There's certainly a risk that situation could be worse, and that could endanger the wider economic recovery. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. certainly lots to think about in that presentation. To help us in guiding our thoughts about it, I'd like to ask Alexandre to share a few words.
Yes, thank you, Tony. Hello everyone. Before taking a question, I would like to emphasize four points. The first is the dimension of this crisis, as Brian underlined. The losses this year will be the biggest in aviation history, over $84 billion in 2020 and nearly $16 billion in 2021. By comparison, airlines lost $31 billion with the global financial crisis, and oil price spiked in 2008 and 9. So there is no comparable to the dimension of this crisis. The second point is the critical importance of governments and industry working together to implement the ICAO restart guidelines. Our research shows that people will return to flying as soon as borders open. That's why we work for and strongly support ICAO's takeoff plan to restart aviation. We must be prepared for the eventual recovery with global measures that are universally implemented, that will give governments the confidence to open borders, and it should give passengers the confidence to fly. In March, we had the disorderly shutdown of the industry. The ICAO guidelines, agreed by governments, are at the core of an orderly restart, provided the guidelines are universally implemented, harmonized, and mutually recognized. This would be stark contrast to post 9/11, when everybody essentially did their own thing, and we have spent 20 years sorting out the differences. And the other reassuring development compared to 9/11 is the agreement that measures are temporary and will be evaluated often as science, technology, and medicine advance. With a continuous updating, including the removal of measures no longer needed for safety, passenger confidence should remain high. The third point that I want to emphasize is the need to avoid quarantine. Screening measures at departure should prevent symptomatic people from flying. Precautionary measures through the journey, social distancing, better sanitization, mask wearing when social distancing is not possible, will keep people safe when traveling. And effective contact tracing on arrival should limit the risk of asymptomatic travelers creating new clusters. This layered approach should give governments the confidence to reopen borders without quarantine measures. Quite frankly, if quarantine is introduced, economies are effectively kept in lockdown for the purpose of travel. Over 80% of travelers tell us that if quarantine is imposed, they won't travel. We are encouraged to see the very fast developments in accurate mass testing capabilities for COVID-19. As confidence in testing grows, we see the potential for it to play a pivotal role in keeping borders open without quarantine. The fourth point is that the industry emerging for this crisis will have much more debt. Airlines entered 2020 in relatively good financial shape. After a decade of profits, debt levels were relatively low, $430 billion, roughly half annual revenues. Vital financial relief measures by governments have kept airlines from going bankrupt, but have ballooned debt by $120 billion to $550 billion. That's about 92% of expected revenues in 2021. Therefore, further relief measures should be focused on helping airlines to generate more working capital and stimulating demand rather than further expanding debt levels. So we have seen that the outlook is challenging, to say the least. But aviation is a resilient industry. With a globally harmonized and mutually recognized approach to the restart measures, we can rebuild the confidence of travelers and kickstart the recovery in aviation, and more broadly. With that, I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Alexandre. Thank you, Brian. There are lots of questions already in the queue, so thank you, everyone. Keep them coming in. We'll start with the first one, which is a question about the Middle East. And it refers back to Brian's slides on loss of confidence or demand in passengers. It seems to say that the Middle East has recorded the lowest loss in demand or passenger confidence of all surveyed regions. Is this accurate, and can I explain why this might be?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm not sure that we have got a particularly fulsome answer. These are anonymous questions. We can't go back to interview the passengers. I mean, I think that it might reflect conditions at the particular time the survey was taken in early April, but I mean the typical. We've seen a widespread impact across the world. There hasn't really been an awful lot to differentiate either the lockdowns, the closure of borders, or the impact on economies. So I don't think it's materially different in the Middle East, in the confidence of passengers in the Middle East than those in other regions.
Great, thank you, Brian. We have a question about Argentina. So the Argentinian government has announced that domestic flights will start operating in July, but not until September for broader international traffic. Is IATA negotiating with the government on this, and do we have any comments we'd like to make?
Yes, we think that these measures are excessive, especially for international flights, and we are pushing the Argentinian government to reopen borders, of course, with the implementation of the measures that have been proposed by ICAO, because we think that the complete closure of borders is to a high limit to international travel, to the recovery of the economy, and to economic development in Argentina. So we are urging the Argentinian government to reopen earlier.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. We have a question about Hong Kong, where the government has provided an aid package to Cathay Pacific. The question is it a win-win for both sides? How would you characterize it?
Is it what?
A win-win for...
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, is the aid package for Cathay Pacific a win-win, I suppose, for the government and for the airline?
It's a clear recognition that the airline industry is absolutely key for Hong Kong, to develop the economy, to maintain the international role and economic, key place of Hong Kong. So it's and this recognition has led the Hong Kong government to provide Cathay Pacific with a significant package to recover. And, as we have advocated in favor of that everywhere in the world and in Hong Kong as anywhere else, we are pretty satisfied with this announcement.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. A question for you, Brian, about some of the assumptions in the forecast. I know that you addressed the idea of a second wave already, but the questioner is asking about factoring in a vaccine or other sort of medical advances in this. How have you accounted for that in the outlook?
No. So we've not factored in a vaccine. But we are assuming that during 2021 we're going to have effective tests, which will simplify the processes and give confidence, because we talked a lot about the price stimulation of demand, but I think it's very clear that to see demand recovering, we need confidence in biosecurity as well, and testing will play a part in that. To sort of further develop the layered approach that's been put in place.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question, I guess, going a bit further than 2021. How soon does IATA see the aviation industry returning to profit? And in particular, how soon could that come for carriers in China?
We don't think that next year will be a year of profit. We didn't see that in the global financial crisis. It took 2 years. We think that will be the case again here. If only because in the passenger business we will we see some delay because of the phased opening. So we haven't put out a forecast beyond 2021, but if you follow the trend, 2022 looks like it could be a year for return of profit, and certainly that would be in line with our longer term forecasts of growth in passenger markets and cargo markets.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question, I guess, about historical context. Previously, IATA had spoken about the industry having lost more money than it made in its entire history. Yet over the last 10 years, we've seen sustained profitability. With this forecast now, are we back into the scenario of having lost more money than the industry has ever made?
We've not made that calculation, but
we shouldn't be very far, Brian.
I think that's probably true.
Yeah. Well, certainly over the last 10 years.
I think we are still in the positive area when we accumulate everything.
Yeah, certainly the industry in our net profits has made more than the 100 billion in net losses that we're expecting over the coming 2 years, if you look at the past 10 years of profitability. Would that be correct, Brian?
That would be correct, yes.
Okay. Okay, we have a question about the African industry. How much bailout money or government support is required for the African industry, particularly given the relatively negative outlook that was just presented? Alexandre, maybe you want to...
For Africa, we see that the profit are around -2 billion for 2020. The situation of the airlines are difficult in many countries, so the amount of money that should be injected is probably around 4 to 6 billion. That would be the right figure for the whole continent, excluding Northern Africa.
Okay. We have a very big picture question asking about what we've talked about the recovery measures through CART. The questioner is basically saying, what is that going to look like when passengers actually arrive at the airport? And they preface it by saying at Dubai, they now have plexiglass barriers set up between seats. Is comfort, for example, going to be put aside for the time being to make sure that the airports are biosecure? Essentially, what should passengers expect?
But the first expectations is travel safe, and so that the measures that will be implemented will guarantee that the travel is safe, and on the whole journey. So not only on board but at the airport. So, but what we have worked out within ICAO, with WHO and with government, is a process that is, I think, the right compromise between what is our main target, which is safety and health safety, and having a process which is, how could I say, bearable, usable for passengers. That is that does not extend, the waiting time for too long. That is not too complicated. That is not too heavy, not too complex. And so normally we should have a process that would be that would not reduce significantly the comfort for passengers in the airport. Extend a bit the waiting time by something between 15 to 30 minutes before boarding, but that's all probably.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. We have a question about aircraft lease rates, and the assumption is that they're falling. And the question is, what's the impact, and wouldn't that be positive for airlines in this situation?
Yes. I think in this sort of environment, every company would want, every company's normal response to a fall in demand would be to lower prices. And certainly, I think we're seeing that with some suppliers, such as the lessors. We do see a risk, I think, with some of the infrastructure providers, airports and ANSPs, and we've seen some postponement of navigation charges. But often in the past we've seen airports and ANSPs trying to recover lost revenues and lost costs, and putting prices up at a time when the market is weak. And obviously, if that happens, airlines that are going to be needing cash to service debt would get into a lot of trouble.
Thank you very much, Brian. Next question concerns the recent relationship between China and the United States, where restrictions were imposed on each other's airlines. And the question is, how will that affect the recovery in international routes for the industry?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Okay, so the question is, over the last few days, we've seen discussions between the U.S. government and China over air rights, and particularly China imposing some restrictions on U.S. carriers and carriers in general, depending on the number of COVID cases that present themselves in the flights that are allowed to happen. And the question is, how does this particular situation, or perhaps even in general, impact on the recovery of international routes?
Well, it clearly slowed down, the potential recovery of the international traffic, but to what extent and how measurable is it? Difficult to say. Huh? I don't know if you have figures on that, Brian, but no, I'm not sure that we have estimate on that.
No, I mean, for the, I guess for both the Chinese and the US airlines, their domestic markets are the sort of key sources of revenue. So in the big picture, it's it's not too much. However, I think at this time where we need to encourage governments open markets and passengers to return, we should hope that governments would avoid these sorts of disputes.
Yeah, and I suppose, Alexandre, it's also a clear indication of why we need to have harmonized and mutually recognized measures implemented by governments.
Yes, absolutely. That's a crucial need.
Okay. We have a question talking about the debt load. So we've discussed how the increasing debt load is a factor on the industry. And the question is there a potential that will change the industry structure in 2021 or beyond? And the question is really, has the bailout as it currently stands simply delayed the inevitable collapse of airlines rather than more broadly solving systemic issues in the industry?
I think that really depends on what happens now. I said earlier, I think that airlines will, they'll need to get rid of some of that debt somehow. That could be through raising equity, and actually, equity markets have remarkably strengthened. I think US equity markets are back where they were before the crisis. So perhaps now is a time for airlines to seek to raise some of that equity. But there's certainly a potential that this could lead to a restructuring of the industry. It could be that it does just postpone changes, and obviously, the obvious consequence could be that airlines fail, and we either see a lot more consolidation of the industry, or if governments feel forced to swap the debt that they provided for equity, more government ownership.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So, Brian, you mentioned the need for price stimulus. And the question is, how important is it that airlines reduce their ticket prices to stimulate demand? And given the indebtedness of the industry, can the industry afford long price wars?
I don't really think the industry can afford to stimulate that. At the moment, airlines are facing the need to service debt. Although fuel prices are low, the restrictions on aircraft utilization and the use of seats are pushing up unit costs. So airlines are facing a sort of very tricky restart. Ideally, they need to be able to recover those costs and generate enough cash flow to service debt and pay debt down. It's just that is not the typical recovery phase where airlines need to get passengers back into their aircraft and are competing with a number of others. So it's a situation that is not sustainable for longs. If markets strengthen significantly, then airlines will be able to recover some of those costs. But if not, that's not a sustainable situation.
Okay. We have another question about the industry indebtedness. Do you think airlines will struggle to tap the capital markets given the rising levels of debt? Well,
that certainly constrains them, yes. I mean, and airlines have certainly improved their financial position, and certainly a number of airlines had got down to investment grade balance sheets. They'd reduced debt. They were looked on favourably by the capital markets. A lot of that has changed. So certainly, yes, the rise in debt will make it either more expensive or more difficult to raise equity. So that certainly raises the challenge for airlines.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about the middle seat. It says that several airlines have begun to introduce products designed to block the spread of COVID from seat to seat, for example, seat dividers, transparencies between seats, etc. Since the current recommendations do not include leaving middle seats empty, do you see airlines spending money on such products in an effort to boost passenger confidence?
I don't think so. Either you implement, the CART recommendations that are minimizing the risk of transmission on board and of spreading the virus from one country to another, from one region to another, and that have been designed, for that purpose, and without having, to either to neutralize seat or to integrate in your aircraft some specific protection equipment, such as a plexiglass separations or whatever. So that in addition, for some of them, are raising other concerns in terms of safety, of emergency evacuation, and so will have to be certified. So I don't think that airlines will implement this type of equipment that looks now not useful and could be difficult to certify.
And Brian, maybe you could also remind us, you did some research on the economic cost of leaving the middle seat empty?
Yes, we did. If you look across the fleet as a whole, it would mean that there would only be something like 62% of seats available for sale, and even if airlines achieved a load factor of 85% on those, that would mean only 50, just a bit more than 50%, 53% of seats would be filled. Now, break-even load factors last year, I don't think anyone achieved break-even at that sort of load factor. So that would be really challenging, and in order to recover the higher cost per passenger that it implies, it would mean, passenger yields sort of 50% higher on average. It's a real challenge for airlines to make money, not using all of the seats.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have another question from Africa, and particularly with respect to Air Namibia, saying that there are press reports that it's in a difficult situation, potentially on the verge of collapse. The question is IATA involved in any negotiations or communications with the Namibian government? And I suppose more broadly, what is IATA's role when airlines begin to go through very, very difficult situations in this crisis?
No, we are involved in advocating generally with every government for financial support. We have always said that the government and has to implement the appropriate set of measures appropriate to the situation of the country, the situation of the budget, and the situation of the airline that is involved in this package. But we are not at all a part of the bilateral negotiation between the airline and the government. That is how could I say, a private discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Alexandre. Yes, and so in this case, no specific comment on the Air Namibia situation. So we have a question, quite an interesting question about point-to-point versus networks. And I suppose the question is, does IATA recommend point-to-point flights instead of transit flights until a vaccine is unavailable or over the next 6 months as the industry is restarting? And could there be some benefits in such schedules, either for airlines or suppliers?
No, we do not recommend a point-to-point versus transit or hub travel. There is no specific recommendation. What we recommend is for every airport, every country and all members to implement the CART recommendations. That is our strong topic now and priority.
Okay. Perhaps, Alexandre, you could comment on the idea of travel bubbles and what role they might play.
Yeah, we see two ideas, to reestablish some not point-to-point but bilateral or relations between countries, either through travel bubbles or through corridors, through flying corridors. But I think it's both ideas are interesting to restart the industry, to experiment the processes, to give confidence between countries, but they have to be temporary. And they will be, I think, they will become useless when every country will have implemented, the set of measures recommended by ICAO.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Alexandre. We have a question about employment. How do we see, or do we have a forecast for employment by year end, and any outlook as to how that might fare in 2021?
Well, clearly, we've seen substantial cuts certainly in payrolls. I think the major impact on employment is going to be seen as we sort of move into the restart period and we see the end of support measures such as government wage subsidies. But the industry is going to be quite a bit smaller than it was before the crisis for several years, and certainly smaller than it was expecting to be, which inevitably will mean that fewer fewer employees are needed. So undoubtedly there will be some job losses, but it's not something we've actually published a forecast on.
Okay. So a question here: how much equity can airlines expect to raise with without some sort of government backing?
But it heavily depends on the situation of the airline. Frankly, we have seen successful operations which have been cancelled. So it really depends specifically on the situation of the airline regarding the level of debt, the age of the fleet, the investment requirements for the near future. So the potential market in the country or region in which this airline operates, that is really depending individually on the situation of the airline, even with the government backing.
We have a question. I'm not sure about the specific incident that it's referring to, but Alexandre or Brian, maybe you've got more knowledge than I do on this. But essentially it's saying, what is our position when carriers are telling their aircraft suppliers that they need to reject the planes that they have ordered, I presume because of the current crisis. Is there any comment, Alexandre or Brian, that you'd like to make on that?
They reject the claim of whom?
The question is specifically referring to Airbus, but I'm not sure of the specific incident.
I do not see it. I'm sorry, but I'm not able to comment on that.
Okay, that's perfect.
I have no knowledge of that. I'm sorry for that.
Yeah. So a couple more questions. One is the two major carriers in South America are now in Chapter 11, LATAM and Avianca. How does this impact connectivity for the region? And what implications does that have for the restart of aviation in South America?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, Alexandre.
Sorry, please, Brian, please.
Okay, I was just going to say, clearly there's a risk here. As we've seen that connectivity has fallen, and connectivity is important beyond just airlines and their shareholders. It's a key element of supporting jobs and growth in the wider economy. But what we have seen in the past is airlines have filled in service when we've seen failures. I think the challenge this time is that every airline is challenged by the current situation. So I think we do need to see governments continuing to provide support for the industry in what's going to be a very challenging restart period. If only to make sure that we do continue to get the connectivity that's essential for the wider economic recovery.
Okay, thank you. Alexandre, anything more to add?
No.
Okay.
Perfect.
If not, then I think the last question for today concerns an announcement made by the Austrian government, where one of the conditions, I suppose, for a sustainable recovery of the industry is not to allow any tickets to be sold, airline tickets, I should say, to be sold under the price of 40 euros per ticket. Does IATA have any comment on that?
No particular comment. We see that we will have to manage the way there are some measures will have to be funded, how the burden will be shared between the various sectors, government, airports, airlines. That is something we are working on for the moment. So no particular comment on the Austrian government policy at this stage.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I think we're still trying to confirm exactly what that announcement was. So I see there's various interpretations of that in the media. So with that, I think we've gone through all of the questions. We're just about at 3 o'clock. Sorry, I see one last. Yes. So one last question. I'm learning that the EU Commission has released its own set of guidelines regarding the freedom of movement and opening of borders, some of which do not conform to ICAO's CART recommendations. What is IATA's response to this situation?
They agree the set of the complete set of guidelines. It's European Commission or EASA has issued some guidelines that are totally aligned with ICAO.
Yeah,
I'm a bit surprised.
Yeah, so the EASA guidelines are totally aligned with ICAO, and I suppose the Commission guidelines for opening borders might have some differential. But I guess the answer...
They have delegated to EASA, the responsibility of issuing, the safety guidelines. I'm very surprised.
Yeah. So I think, again, with that, we'll need to do some research. If the questioner wants to identify themselves and drop us a note at corpcoms@iata.org, we'll be happy to get back to you. But as you can appreciate, some of these things are happening in real time, and we'd like not to make comments on issues unless we're absolutely sure of the facts behind them. So thank you all very much.